You thought I was broken. Look at me now.
Growing up, I learned early on that life had a way of throwing unexpected punches. My father, a factory worker, disappeared from my life before I was old enough to understand what abandonment meant. He died in an accident, leaving behind only debts and a grieving mother who struggled to find her footing. She moved from one relationship to another, searching for stability, while I learned to fend for myself. By 16, I had already earned my GED and enrolled in college, determined to carve a different path for my future. Almost 2 years have passed since my wife's boyfriend beat me in front of her. It happened on a Saturday while I was mowing the lawn. As I finished, I saw Kim standing on the back patio with a man I'd never seen before. A tall, lean, light-skinned black guy, barely 21. The way they stood together made it clear they were more than just friends. I stopped the mower and approached them. The guy immediately stepped back, bracing himself. Kim, however, didn't look worried. If anything, her expression held a hint of mockery. We'd been married for 3 years, living in the house I inherited from my grandmother. Kim was 23, a slim blonde with short hair and an easy smile, though that smile was absent in that moment. Instead, she coolly introduced the man as Jamal, her boyfriend, and admitted they'd been seeing each other for a month. She had no intention of leaving me, just wanted to enjoy life with him while expecting me to tolerate it. I told them both to leave, but Jamal refused, claiming they were staying. I reminded them it was my house, threatening to call the police. Kim, unconcerned, waved my phone around as if daring me. I snatched it back, but before I could dial, Jamal hit me hard. The first punch knocked me back, the second doubled me over. He didn't stop there, landing blows to my ribs, kidneys, and stomach until I collapsed. He stomped on my phone, destroying it, while Kim stood by, smirking. Jamal stood over me, triumphant, his foot pressed to my chest like a victor posing over his opponent. Kim laughed, taunting that I could never match Jamal in strength or in keeping her satisfied. Jamal echoed her words, delivering another sharp kick to my ribs until I submitted, agreeing to everything he said just to make it stop. Satisfied, he led Kim into the house, announcing his intention to sleep with her in our bed. Too battered to stand, I crawled toward the back gate. Halfway there, a neighbor, Bob, spotted me and rushed over. Ignoring my plea to avoid calling the police, he helped me into his car and drove me to the ER. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed I had no internal damage, just severe bruising. They patched me up and warned the police were already notified. Detectives arrived, took my statement, and identified Jamal as a young professional boxer. They told me I was lucky the injuries weren't worse. Released that evening, I returned home to find Kim gone, most of her clothes missing. The bed was unmade, the room still heavy with the scent of closeness. Without hesitation, I called a locksmith to change the locks immediately, regardless of the extra cost. After showering and changing, I checked my bank accounts. Everything was intact, so I transferred the maximum amount to a new account in my name and canceled all joint credit cards. Then I sat alone, replaying the events and deciding what to do next. Despite my usually calm demeanor, I've always carried a quiet reservoir of anger, likely born from an unstable childhood. My parents fought constantly until my father walked out one night, never to return. He died in an industrial accident, leaving life insurance and a trust for me. My mother spiraled, cycling through relationships while I grew up fast, earning my GED at 16 and heading to community college. By 18, I'd graduated from a university with a finance degree and a minor in computer science. I hadn't dated much until I met Kim on my 18th birthday. She was a year older, vibrant, confident, and way out of my league, or so I thought. That night, at a small party with friends, she approached me, made it clear she was interested, and took charge. I followed her lead, and before I knew it, we were inseparable. Looking back, I realized I'd ignored the red flags, blinded by affection and inexperience. But after that brutal wake-up call, one thing became certain. I'd never let myself be humiliated like that again. That night changed everything. After a brief conversation at the party, Kim led me across the lawn to her apartment near campus. Without hesitation, she guided me to her bedroom, the dim light casting soft shadows. Clothes fell away, and with quiet confidence, she took control. That night, I lost my pureness. It wasn't just a one-time experience. Kim was determined to teach me everything she enjoyed, and we spent hours together until exhaustion finally set in. From that moment, our lives intertwined. Kim moved in, and after graduation, we both found local jobs. I worked as a programmer for a retail company, while she joined a small accounting firm. A year later, we got married. Her parents, Eileen and John, were hesitant about us marrying so young, but supported the wedding and even gifted us a honeymoon in Jamaica. My mother showed up with her new partner, a much older man, after years of being distant. We settled into my inherited house after the tenants moved out, and life seemed stable. 18 months into the marriage, I launched my own business, offering accounting and IT services for small companies. My former employer became my first client, and soon the business grew enough to hire 2 employees. I worked long hours, often neglecting time at home, though Kim and I still shared moments together until, gradually, we didn't. About a month before everything fell apart, Kim grew distant. Our intimacy dwindled, and she frequently spent nights out with friends. One Friday, she called after midnight, claiming she was too drunk to come home. When I later saw her with Jamal, I wasn't entirely surprised. Suspicious of her behavior, I had already researched divorce laws, realizing she had no claim to the house or trust fund, though my business assets were less clear. The weekend after the fight, I called Kim's parents. Her father doubted my story, while her mother, Eileen, suggested it might be tied to Kim's past instability, something they'd never discussed with me. Determined to protect myself, I hired a security company to install an alarm system with police alerts. It was finished just before dark, and not long after, Kim called. Furious that I'd told her parents. Her voicemail was filled with threats, which I promptly reported to the detectives. They confirmed it was enough for a warrant. Early Monday morning, around 2 a.m., Kim and Jamal tried to break in using her old key, unaware the locks had been changed. I warned them to leave, and after a brief standoff, they drove away. That day, I met with a lawyer, secured power of attorney, closed our joint bank account, and transferred all funds into a private account. I also contacted a moving company, cleared out the house, and placed a for rent sign on the lawn. By Tuesday evening, everything valuable was packed into my motorcycle saddlebags. To fully cut ties, I bought a new phone with a fresh number, powered down the old one, and reached out to Jackson, a close friend living 2 hours away. He and his wife, Jenna, welcomed me into their renovated barn home, offering a spare room. Over drinks, I explained everything. Jenna, who knew Kim from school, called her behavior irrational. Jack then pulled up an article on his phone. Jamal had been arrested for attacking me, with bail set at $50,000 already posted. Relieved to be off the radar, I mentioned my interest in Paxton Farm, a nearby place known for self-defense training. Jack knew the owners, an older man and his daughter, and agreed to introduce me the next morning. After a quiet night, I met their daughter, Dee Dee, and we headed to the farm. As we drove up the mountain, I realized I wasn't just seeking safety. I was preparing for whatever came next, determined never to be caught off guard again. The farm had a circular driveway leading to a large wooden building. Behind it stood several houses and a metal structure. As Jack and I arrived, a man in his 60s and a young woman around my age, both dressed in loose tracksuits and beanies, met us. Their presence suggested they were expecting us. Jack introduced me, explaining that I was looking for self-defense training. The older man, Manny, invited us inside, mentioning they didn't accept just anyone without understanding their situation. The interior was simple but well kept, with a large central room flanked by doorways and a wraparound balcony with rooms above. 2 fireplaces burned at either end, adding warmth to the space. Once seated, I shared everything. No filters, no embellishments. When I finished, the woman, Jen, asked if I planned to become a boxer and fight Jamal. I admitted I hadn't considered it that way, but wanted to be prepared if another confrontation happened. Deep down, I knew I intended to face him eventually. Manny stood and asked me to do the same. Without warning, he slapped me with his right hand and immediately followed with his left. I absorbed the first hit, but instinctively blocked the second. He stepped back, nodding approvingly. "You can stay," he said, thanking Jack for the referral. After Jack left, Jen led me to a small cabin marked with the number 6. Inside was a modest room with a bed, desk, and bathroom. She told me I'd be referred to as 6th during my stay, as many clients valued anonymity. Names were reserved for staff, herself, Manny, and a few others. I assured her I had no interest in anyone else's business and appreciated the same privacy in return. Once alone, I unpacked, noticing a tracksuit neatly laid out. I set up my laptop, finding 2 available networks, one password protected. Checking my old phone remotely, I saw missed messages from the police and Kim's parents. The police wanted me to visit the prosecutor, while her parents informed me Kim had been arrested for phone threats, jeopardizing her job. I sighed, texted my lawyer my new number, and checked Jamal's status. He was still scheduled for a fight the following week. Curious about the metal building, I wandered over and found the door open. Inside, Two men, one blonde, one black, were sparring under Manny's supervision. Both were tall, around 6'2" and 200 pounds, wearing protective gear while exchanging controlled strikes. It was intense, but disciplined. After a flurry of punches, one knocked the other down, only for the fallen fighter to roll up and land a swift kick. Manny blew a whistle, ending the session with praise. As the fighters exited, Manny approached, asking how Jamal had landed those punches when I'd just blocked his own strike. He insisted Jamal's speed wasn't superior, and that I should have anticipated his attack more than Manny's. After some thought, I admitted it wasn't just adrenaline. I'd been furious. Manny nodded, calling it a lesson about rage and skill before leaving. The gym was impressively equipped with weights, cardio machines, and training tools I didn't recognize. Outside, I spotted a massive wood pile. Grabbing a 6-pound axe, I lost myself in chopping logs, focusing on precision and power. Time flew until the lunch bell rang. Looking up, I saw Manny and Jen watching, surrounded by a mountain of split wood. I offered to clean up, but Manny waved it off, saying I'd be needed in the training room after lunch. Lunch was quiet, served buffet style. I sat with the two morning fighters. Mid-meal, Manny introduced me as the sixth, a newcomer with less experience but potential. The room briefly turned its attention to me. I simply waved, prompting laughter before everyone resumed eating. After lunch, Manny led me to the training area, joined by two men known as the second and the fourth. Both were broad-shouldered, speaking in what sounded like a Slavic language. Inside, they geared up with gloves and pads while Manny guided me to a separate mat. "We train for survival here," Manny explained. "No rules, no restrictions. Everything is allowed. Understand?" I nodded. "Survival. Got it." And with that, my real training began. Manny and I geared up with gloves and pads, diving into a rigorous training session. He demonstrated combinations of punches, kicks, and spins, moving seamlessly between strikes. My task was to mirror his movements, which I managed with surprising ease despite the intensity. After an hour, Manny noted my quick adaptation and decided to push me further. We moved to the heavy bags where he demonstrated a spinning elbow strike aimed at head level. It took me several tries to get it right, but by the end of the session, I was consistently hitting the target. Satisfied, Manny marked specific spots on the bag for precision training. It didn't take long before I was landing strikes accurately every time. As we wrapped up, Manny exchanged a knowing smile with second and fourth, who had finished their sparring and were observing from across the hall. Second, speaking with a slight accent, commented that I didn't seem like a novice, but Manny insisted I was, despite my quick progress. We returned to the main building around 5:30. Second and fourth headed to their cabins, while Manny instructed me to shower and change into a fresh tracksuit for dinner. The hot water was a welcome relief after hours of exertion. Dinner was simple but satisfying: cutlets, coleslaw, and fresh buns with water or milk. I sat with 1 and 7, two tall, athletic Americans who casually discussed football. They avoided personal topics, but the conversation flowed easily, settling on the Ravens as likely championship contenders. After dinner, Jen approached, commenting on my earlier woodchopping session. I explained it was something I'd done often in my youth, finding the repetitive motion almost meditative. She then outlined my daily schedule: a 5 a.m. wake-up, morning run, breakfast at 6, followed by individual training until lunch, then more practice until dinner. As we walked toward my cabin, Jen surprised me with an observation about my physical abilities. She believed I underestimated myself, assuming anyone could match my coordination and speed. I brushed it off, attributing my skills to childhood habits rather than natural talent. She disagreed, emphasizing the importance of recognizing my strengths without arrogance, but with realistic self-awareness. At my cabin, she turned and left, though something about her demeanor made me wonder if she'd sensed my lingering gaze. After a few steps, she glanced back, holding my gaze for a long moment before continuing on. The next morning, the farm's gong woke me at 5. I dressed and joined 4 others for a run along the mountain trail. 1 and 7 led, while 5, despite looking like a seasoned runner, fell behind. I kept pace with the leaders before pushing harder, passing them on the incline and reaching the summit first. They arrived shortly after, acknowledging my stamina with a mix of surprise and respect. Back at the farm, Jen was waiting. Without much explanation, she led me to a small training room behind the main building. Inside, she strapped on gloves and pads, clearly preparing for a sparring session. I hesitated, but she made it clear this wasn't light training. I needed to fight seriously, or risk being overwhelmed. The first exchange was humbling. I attempted a basic strike Manny had taught me, but within seconds I was flat on my back. Jen had effortlessly flipped me, standing over me with a knowing smile. Every attempt to gain the upper hand ended the same way. I landed a few glancing blows, but her counters were swift and precise. Eventually, I managed to push her off balance, momentarily gaining control, only for her to reverse the situation and pin me down once again. By the end of the session, my body ached, but Jen seemed satisfied with my progress. She noted my composure under pressure, a trait she considered rare and valuable. Despite losing every round, I remained focused, more determined than frustrated. The following week followed a steady rhythm. Mornings belonged to Jen, who consistently outmaneuvered me, while afternoons were spent under Manny's guidance, refining techniques and learning new variations. Gradually, I improved, leaning into my strengths: quick reflexes, sharp hand-eye coordination, and upper body speed. I adapted my approach, focusing more on close-range strikes and minimizing kicks, which often left me vulnerable. One morning, after an especially intense session, Jen acknowledged my progress. Our sparring lasted longer, and though she ultimately won, the gap was closing. There was a mutual respect in her final nod, a silent acknowledgement that I was no longer entirely outmatched. Later that evening, I invited her to join me after dinner, not for training, but for conversation. She agreed without hesitation, and for the first time since arriving, the farm felt less like a battleground, and more like a place where I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece. At exactly 8 p.m., Jen appeared around the corner of the main house, wearing a sea green tracksuit, contrasting with my plain gray one. We sat across from each other on the porch, the cool evening air settling around us. Our conversation drifted into personal territory. Jen shared her life story, training with her father since childhood, losing her mother to cancer at 12, serving 2 years in the Army as a martial arts instructor, and eventually returning to the farm to help her father run the growing business. She was 24, grounded, and fiercely independent. I told her about my fractured family, my relationship with Kim, and the sudden, brutal collapse of my marriage. Jen questioned the drastic change in Kim's behavior, suggesting it might be more than infatuation with a boxer. Her insight struck a chord, making me realize how little I'd truly understood the situation. The conversation took a lighter turn, and soon words gave way to action. We ended up in my cabin, the tension between us breaking in a whirlwind of passion. Jen was strong, almost my equal in size, and as assertive in bed as she was in the training room. The night blurred into hours of intensity, leaving us both exhausted by the early morning. When the 5 a.m. gong sounded, I dragged myself out of bed, sore and drained. During the morning run, the other trainees exchanged knowing smiles as I lagged behind. Jen pushed me hard during our sparring session, but I was off my game, distracted and fatigued. After several failed attempts, I refocused, cleared my mind, and finally managed to knock her down. She acknowledged my resilience, noting that when I was fully present, I could match her skill. Later that day, a small crowd gathered outside the training room, curious about my condition. Apparently, Jen's past partners rarely walked away unscathed after a night with her, both in and out of training. First confirmed the rumors, joking about how they'd expected her company that night, but she had stayed away. Over the next few days, training intensified. Manny introduced advanced footwork techniques designed to create openings for strikes. Practicing against Seven, I struggled at first but gradually found my rhythm. A well-executed feint led to my first clean takedown, earning a nod of respect from both Manny and Seven. After our final spar, Seven admitted Jen had been distant the previous night, different from their usual dynamic. He suspected my presence had shifted something in her. I dismissed it, but the thought lingered. The next 3 months passed in a blur of training and quiet companionship. Jen and I grew inseparable, both on and off the mats. New trainees came and went, but none shared the connection we had. My skills sharpened, eventually allowing me to hold my own against Manny himself. One evening after dinner, Manny called me into his office. He asked if I had a plan for confronting Jamal. I admitted I didn't, just vague thoughts about returning home and seeing what unfolded. Manny cautioned that any street fight, given the history, could land me in prison. He'd seen how close Jen and I had become and didn't want to see my progress unravel. That's when he proposed a plan, one that would settle things without risking my freedom. The following week, I drove to Mountain City after my morning run, heading straight to the boxing gym by the railroad tracks. The gym, run by former near-champion Jenks Martin, was known for training top-tier fighters, including light heavyweight Jerry Totem and a rising welterweight star. Manny had already spoken to Jenks about me. After a brief chat in his office, I changed clothes and began a rigorous training routine. Light bag, heavy bag, jump rope, and by day's end, a sparring round with a local heavyweight. Jenks told me to avoid getting hit rather than land punches, which I managed, though I was thoroughly exhausted despite my training at the farm. Jen was curious about my progress, and I kept her updated. After 2 weeks, Jenks secured my first professional club fight under the name BB Farmer. It was a 3-round light heavyweight bout against Larry Bonds. Following Jenks' advice, I controlled the fight, landing clean shots without going for a knockout. Bonds barely touched me, and I won by unanimous decision. My days became a cycle of intense training with Jenks, nights spent with Jen, weightlifting, and chopping wood to stockpile for winter. Eventually, I began sparring with Rashard Jones, a professional light heavyweight under Jenks' wing. Rashard didn't hold back, and his powerful punches kept me sharp. Inspired by his rapid-fire combinations, I focused on developing faster hand speed and increased my work on the heavy bag. Within 2 months, I could hold my own against him. By then, I had fought 12 professional bouts, 10 local and 2 out of state, winning all. 9 victories came by decision, but one cocky opponent pushed me too far. His taunts fueled my anger, and I knocked him out cold in the second round. It was a mistake on his part, thinking I'd be an easy mark. Jenks eventually asked if I felt ready for the real challenge, Jamal Bennett. Bennett had built his record by knocking out weaker opponents in monthly showcase fights. Now I was next in line. The payout was $4,000 plus expenses. I accepted without hesitation. For 6 weeks, I studied Bennett's fight tapes, growing more furious with each viewing. During sparring, I had to consciously restrain myself, prompting several warnings from Jenks. When fight week arrived, our team, Jenks, Manny, Jen, and I, headed to Washington. Bennett was a local favorite, highly ranked among light heavyweights. The fight was set for Friday night in a 5,000-seat venue, nearly sold out and broadcast on cable. It was billed as a battle of undefeated fighters. Until then, I'd heard little about Bennett or Kim. No news, no updates. My old life seemed completely detached from my current one. Bennett's team clearly didn't take me seriously, viewing the match as just another paycheck. On fight night, while I was preparing backstage, Manny pulled me aside with unexpected news. Kim was there, sitting ringside with a baby. Whether she knew I was Bennett's opponent was unclear, but someone on his team had likely recognized me from fight footage. Entering the ring, I kept my hood up, ignoring the crowd's jeers. Bennett, ever the showman, strutted in to wild applause. I watched him closely, feeling anger bubble beneath my calm exterior. When we were called to the center for the pre-fight instructions, I kept the hood on. Bennett, bouncing with overconfidence, had no clue who I was. Then I saw Kim, her child beside her. As the bell rang, I removed my hood, locking eyes with her. Her face froze in shock. Bennett charged out aggressively, throwing flashy but ineffective punches. His rhythm, an obvious, predictable pattern, quickly became clear. Within the first minute, I found my timing. His jab missed as he shifted right, and I countered with 2 sharp jabs followed by a lightning-fast right cross that caught him square on the cheek. He staggered, and fury surged within me. Driven by rage, I forced him to the ropes, landing brutal body shots. Right, left, ribs, kidney. I felt his strength falter. Stepping back, I delivered a crushing right to his jaw, sending him into the ropes. He was out cold, but as he rebounded toward me, his head hung perfectly in line for another devastating punch, one that could have ended him permanently. My fist clenched, the familiar rage boiling inside. But I stopped. The anger vanished as quickly as it came. Bennett collapsed unconscious. I stood still for a moment, glancing at Kim, who sat frozen in disbelief. Silently, I flexed my muscles and mouthed a single word. Witch. Then I turned, climbed through the ropes, and left the ring without looking back. We headed straight to the locker room. No interviews, no fanfare. Manny was already outside with a van packed and ready. We drove off, beers in hand for Jenks and me, laughing in the back seat. It was a 2-hour ride back to the farm, and the adrenaline was still high when Manny asked the question that had been on his mind. Why didn't you finish him, Brian? I saw the rage in you. I hesitated, unsure myself. I don't know. I could have liquidated him, but I didn't want that on my conscience. Jen nodded. Good, he's hurt enough. That final shot would have been legal, but unnecessary. We arrived at the farm late. While Jen and I headed upstairs, Jenks flipped on ESPN. There it was, our fight, condensed into 90 seconds. The caption read, Bennett knocked out by BB Farmer, opponent disappears after win. We laughed, knowing the quick exit was to avoid any potential backlash from Bennett's friends. Exhausted but restless, I watched the replay. Seeing myself in the ring was surreal, like observing a stranger. In slow motion, I caught the moment I could have ended Bennett. My face shifted from pure rage to hollow emptiness in an instant. The fury had drained, replaced by something close to despair. I hadn't felt despair in the moment, but that's exactly how I looked. The tension in my body was clear when I glanced at Kim. I'd forgotten that part, but the video didn't lie. Jen squeezed my hand, and I realized I was gripping hers tightly. We locked eyes, understanding passing between us without words. I stood, pulling her along with me. "Time for bed," I whispered, needing her presence more than ever. That night, there was no passion, just comfort. We showered quietly, dressed in soft pajamas, and held each other under the covers. Jen asked how I felt watching the fight. I admitted feeling detached, like the fighter in the ring wasn't truly me. After a pause, she brought up Kim. Jen believed I needed closure, not for revenge, but to understand why my marriage had unraveled so suddenly. She reminded me that Kim's parents had mentioned past mental health struggles, something I'd never fully explored. I resisted. Seeing Kim again, especially knowing she had a child with Bennett, felt unbearable. But Jen was right. Without answers, uncertainty would linger, even between us. She suggested visiting Kim's parents first, just to understand the full picture. Reluctantly, I agreed to think it over. By morning, it was clear. I couldn't move forward until I uncovered the truth. The next day, Jen and I followed up on a few things. Bennett was still hospitalized, not in critical condition, but facing possible long-term damage. We found out he and Kim were living together in a Virginia condo, with vague mentions of a child, but no details or photos. ESPN had run a piece on Bennett's rise and the fight, featuring an old clip of Kim hugging him after a previous win. They speculated about his uncertain future in boxing. Feeling restless, I called Kim's parents, John and Eileen. They lived near Washington. John worked as a civilian at the Pentagon, and Eileen taught high school math. When Eileen answered, she sounded surprised but not hostile. I explained I wasn't calling about Bennett, but needed clarity about my marriage's abrupt end. She promised to discuss it with John and call back. While waiting, Jen and I kept busy. Reporters eventually found their way to the farm, making some clients uneasy and putting Manny on edge. A friend in public relations advised that the press wouldn't back off until they got more information. Secrets, he said, only fueled their persistence. To get ahead of the situation, I asked Jenks to organize a press conference at the gym for that evening. Just as we were preparing, Kim's parents called back, agreeing to meet for dinner in Washington in 2 days. I thanked them and turned my focus back to the press. At the conference, video cameras and flashing lights filled the room. I read a brief statement, expressing hope for Bennett's recovery and gratitude for the opportunity to fight such a prominent contender. When the questions started, I kept my answers short. I admitted feeling numb after the knockout, confident before the fight, and unsure about future matches. When asked why I flexed after Bennett fell, I claimed not to remember. As for the word witch, I flatly denied saying it. Someone asked if I'd spoken to Bennett's girlfriend. I lied and said no. Jenks ended the conference before it got too heated. We exited into the main gym where the fighters, clad in gloves, greeted me with applause and friendly jabs. It struck me how much these guys respected me, not just for the win, but for the restraint I'd shown. That moment weighed on me later as I questioned whether I wanted to keep fighting. That night, Jen and I sparred on the mats. She hit harder than Bennett, but I barely edged out a win. We shared dinner with the other fighters, who applauded me again, and later, we relaxed upstairs, watching an old James Garner movie before bed. The upcoming dinner with Kim's parents made me uneasy, so I asked Jen to come along. We booked a hotel for the night, and John and Eileen arrived right on time. After polite greetings and introductions, we ordered drinks, and I got straight to the point. I needed answers about what really happened with Kim. Eileen was the first to speak. She revealed that Kim had a history of mental health issues, including a nervous breakdown at 13 and a violent episode a year later when she attacked a classmate with a bat. Hospitalization followed, but she eventually seemed to recover. John chimed in, calling her sudden behavior with Bennett a relapse, though nothing had seemed off when she introduced him to them shortly before everything fell apart. I asked why they hadn't warned me. They explained that Kim had assured them she would tell me herself, so they stayed quiet, unaware of how quickly things would spiral. The conversation shifted to Kim's current life. She was still with Bennett, raising a child, little Johnny. Eileen insisted Bennett wasn't a thug, despite everything. When I asked the child's age, John hesitated before saying he was 11 months old. That timeline hit me hard. Kim had likely been pregnant when she first introduced Bennett to her parents. Jen, always sharp, asked if they had any pictures of Johnny. The awkward silence that followed was telling. They had none, not even on their phones. Suspicious, Jen bluntly stated what I was beginning to suspect. Johnny was my son, not Bennett's. Eileen reluctantly confirmed it. Kim had told them it was Jamal's child and insisted they keep quiet. But as Eileen put it, the baby looks just like you. I sat there stunned. I could understand Kim's betrayal after the beating, but hiding my child? That was unforgivable. John, trying to sound pragmatic, asked what good it would do to get involved now. I disagreed immediately. This was my son. I couldn't just walk away. The waiter interrupted to take our order, momentarily easing the tension. Afterward, Jen pressed further about the divorce and pregnancy. Eileen explained that Kim's lawyer had handled everything with no mention of a child. By the time Johnny was born, Jamal's name was on the birth certificate, and the divorce had long been finalized. They had assumed the baby was his, given how often Kim was with Bennett and how little time she'd spent with me in those final months. I asked about Kim and Jamal's relationship now. John revealed that Jamal had discovered the truth shortly after Johnny's birth. He left for a week, but eventually returned, though he took little interest in parenting duties. The conversation wound down with news of Bennett's condition. He was struggling to speak clearly, though doctors expected improvement with rest. John admitted he'd watched the fight live and seen the moment I could have delivered a fatal punch. He didn't understand why I held back, but he believed Bennett had gotten what he deserved. Eileen quietly asked how I felt about it. I didn't hesitate. I was glad I'd won. I could have liquidated him, but I didn't. That was enough for me. As we prepared to leave, John mentioned that Johnny was currently with them, under a nanny's care. That revelation solidified my decision. I wasn't going to walk away from my son. Not now, not ever. Dinner arrived, but I barely touched my meal. Jen, noticing my lack of appetite, finished hers and most of mine. Conversation was minimal until I finally asked to see the pictures of Johnny. Eileen handed me her phone, scrolling through countless photos and videos while they enjoyed dessert and coffee. Jen glanced over my shoulder and smiled. "He's adorable," she said. Eileen nodded in agreement, adding that Johnny clearly loved both his mom and Jamal, as shown in the videos. I told them I wanted to meet Johnny the next day. John hesitated, worried about going behind Kim's back, but I reminded him I had options, including a DNA test and legal action over the fraudulent birth certificate. Reluctantly, he agreed to a lunch meeting at their house. Back in our hotel room, Jen and I ordered wine and discussed the situation. I planned to call Harry Bacon, a lawyer across the river, for advice on Virginia custody laws. When Jen asked how I felt, I admitted my focus was on Johnny, not Kim. I loved Jen, and nothing about this changed that. The next day, we arrived at John and Eileen's house, where little Johnny played quietly with wooden blocks in the living room. I crouched beside him, stacking blocks until he gleefully knocked the tower down, laughing. We repeated the game several times before lunch. When Eileen called us to the table, Johnny toddled toward the dining room, gripping my hand for balance. He sat in a high chair, munching on bread with peanut butter and celery while we had quiche. Midway through lunch, Eileen's phone rang. It was Kim, informing her that Jamal had been moved to a nearby rehab center. She planned to stop by the house once he was settled, likely within 30 minutes. Jen quietly noted there was no point delaying the inevitable. John agreed, but warned us to expect resistance. After lunch, Eileen took Johnny upstairs for a nap while we discussed the next steps. John planned to meet Kim at the curb, explain our presence, and try to ease the tension. When her car pulled up, Jen and I watched from the window. Kim, looking tired but composed, seemed upset upon seeing her father. Their conversation grew animated, and when Eileen joined them, Kim reluctantly followed her parents inside. Her expression hardened when she saw me. "You bastard!" she snapped. "You hurt Jamal." I stayed calm. "Not as much as I could have, and you're hardly in a position to lecture me, Kim. Payback's rough, isn't it?" Her anger faltered. She dropped her gaze, silent for a moment before admitting, "It's my fault. I made a mess of everything. I fell for Jamal, and it spiraled. I knew I was destroying everything but couldn't stop. The worst day of my life was when I stood by and let him humiliate you." I asked why she'd wanted me beaten. She confessed it was fear, that I'd retaliate, as I eventually did. In her mind, striking first seemed like self-preservation, twisted as it was. I glanced at Jen. "Well, things turned out fine for me. I'm happy now. But hiding Johnny? That's unforgivable." Kim stiffened. "I don't want you in his life. Jamal's his dad. He's been there since the start. Only because you lied. That's over now." I'll do whatever it takes to be part of Johnny's life." She sighed, defeated. With Jamal's health uncertain, she lacked the fight she once had. Quietly, she revealed Jamal had suffered a serious concussion and might face lasting complications. Doctors were hopeful, but cautious. "How did you get so good, Brian?" she asked. "He's one of the best." "Motivation and expert training," I replied, nodding toward Jen. "He underestimated me, thought I was just another easy win." Eileen suggested we move the conversation to the living room, offering Kim some water. As we sat down, Kim admitted none of them had known I'd be Jamal's opponent until I removed my robe in the ring. She'd wanted to stop the fight but couldn't react fast enough. We discussed Johnny's future. I made it clear I wouldn't walk away. Jen and I would decide our next steps together, prioritizing Johnny's well-being. Eventually, Kim, emotionally drained, went upstairs to rest. Back at the hotel, Jen called Manny, updating him about Johnny. To my surprise, she laughed. "Manny's excited to meet him," she said. "Apparently, he's not as stoic as he seems." The next morning, I consulted a custody lawyer and returned to the Clark's house with a clearer understanding of my rights. Jen and I suggested Johnny spend time at the farm, though Kim would likely need to accompany him, or perhaps Eileen and John. Kim had already consulted her own lawyer and, surprisingly, wasn't entirely opposed to shared custody. While we talked, Jen played with Johnny, building another block tower. When he tried to knock it down, she caught it mid-fall, tilting it back upright. Kim and I exchanged glances. It was a small moment, but felt significant. Eventually, we agreed that Eileen would bring Johnny to the farm for a week. Kim would stay behind to manage Jamal's care. The one-week visit stretched into two, with Johnny quickly becoming the heart of the farm. Everyone adored him, and Eileen, enjoying the lively atmosphere, even indulged in light flirting with the younger men. It was harmless, and eventually she seemed content to just enjoy the change of scenery. The path forward was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Johnny was my son, and I wasn't going anywhere. As Johnny grew more active, Jen and I often entertained him after dinner, with Manny joining in when time allowed. Running the farm kept us busy, so Manny decided to hire another instructor. He had someone in mind, Chin Young, a 34-year-old Pennsylvania native with military experience, including training fighters for the government. Despite his age, Chin looked barely 20. Chin traveled from Pittsburgh for the interview. We all liked his attitude and experience, and he accepted the job immediately, needing 2 weeks to wrap up his affairs. As he left, he mentioned seeing footage of my fight, hinting he recognized me. I admitted it was me, calling it a long story. He smiled, saying he'd like to hear it someday. His nickname, Incredibly Rob, piqued my curiosity, though I doubted the story behind it was entirely innocent. As Chin walked away, Eileen appeared, exchanging pleasantries with him. The subtle flirtation between them didn't go unnoticed, and I briefly wondered if Kim had inherited more than just her mother's looks. Soon after, Jen and I drove Eileen and Johnny back to Virginia. Kim was waiting, and the reunion between her and Johnny was heartwarming, though the history between us dulled its emotional impact. Still, I was curious to hear her side of everything. After Johnny settled down and John called us for dinner, Jen quietly urged me to have that long-overdue conversation with Kim. I found her in the living room with Eileen. Hesitant but determined, I asked if we could talk outside. She looked wary but agreed. In the backyard, the truth spilled out. Kim admitted her affair with Jamal started because of physical attraction, fueled by a long-standing preference for black men. One night at a bar, Jamal flirted, she gave in, and the excitement quickly escalated into an ongoing affair. She claimed it wasn't about me, we had been a good couple, but her restless nature had always made her prone to impulsive choices. When I asked why she'd gone so far as to humiliate me, her answer was both bitter and revealing. Guilt from the affair twisted her perspective, making her resent me to justify her betrayal. It wasn't a psychotic break like her teenage episodes, but rather a warped attempt to shift blame. She admitted it was irrational, even cruel, but at the time it felt like self-preservation. Talk turned to Johnny and custody. Neither of us wanted a legal battle. I suggested shared custody, but Kim's ties to her new life made extended visits difficult. I mentioned the possibility of buying property near the farm, a defunct ski resort I'd been eyeing. If I made the purchase, I could offer her a place nearby, though I doubted Jamal would be part of that arrangement. Kim seemed indifferent about Jamal, calling him whiny and irritating. When I asked why Jamal had agreed to the original ambush, she revealed he carried deep-seated rage, often masked by his career. Growing up in the inner city, he'd faced constant bullying, fueling a bitterness specifically aimed at men like me, men he perceived as privileged and untouchable. By the time we finished talking, I finally understood Kim. She wasn't evil, just deeply flawed, easily swayed, driven by guilt, and prone to destructive choices. It didn't excuse her actions, but it explained them. Dinner was pleasant. John, a surprisingly good cook, had prepared everything. On the drive back to the farm, I told Jen about my conversation with Kim. To my surprise, she admitted she'd quietly listened from an upstairs window. She believed Kim had been as honest as she could be, and I agreed. This was likely the closest I'd ever get to the full truth. Feeling uncharacteristically light, I glanced at Jen and asked, "Will you marry me?" It was impulsive, but the weight of the past had finally lifted. She cried, laughed, and said yes, teasing me for proposing while driving. We married a month later in a small ceremony at the farm. Manny's sister attended with her family, and John, Eileen, and Johnny were there. Kim declined the invitation, despite Jen's insistence. Afterward, Jen and I took a brief honeymoon in Delaware before returning to work. Soon after, I signed a contract for a $200,000 light heavyweight fight against contender Rick Sutter. The payday was substantial because of my mystery fighter status, a club boxer rising through the ranks like something out of Rocky. The fight was set for a month later, and I planned to use the earnings to buy the ski resort. Jen, Manny, and Jenks helped devise a strict training routine. Jenks advocated abstinence, but Jen dismissed the idea. I trained hard and traveled to Philadelphia for the fight. Sutter, a cocky fighter with a shaved head, had won 33 of his 34 bouts. Jenks and I studied his footage closely. The fight itself went the full 12 rounds, a grueling battle that left me sore for 2 weeks. I knocked him down in the 10th with a right cross, thinking it was over, but the bell saved him. He recovered and finished the fight, earning my respect despite his showboating. After winning by decision, I briefly addressed the press, admitting I wasn't sure if I'd continue boxing. Then, I returned to the farm and contacted a realtor about the abandoned ski resort, 52 acres with a lodge and cabins, previously used as a summer camp. With $150,000 from the fight and some savings, I bought it outright. Around the same time, I finalized the sale of my business. It had thrived, and I arranged a deal with my employees, receiving an initial payout and ongoing semi-annual payments. Suddenly, I was a landowner, expanding Manny's operation with a second location. Chin, now fully settled, proved invaluable, balancing my absence with ease. He eventually brought in his old army buddy, Billy Williams, another skilled instructor. Manny hired him without hesitation. Business flourished. Fighters came and went, and the training center remained profitable. The real secret to its success, I realized, wasn't just the facilities or instructors. It was Manny himself, a rare teacher whose skill and insight couldn't be replicated. He was the foundation of it all, and I was proud to be part of it. When the excitement around my boxing career died down, life on the farm with Jen felt peaceful, until Kim showed up with little Johnny after breaking things off with Jamal. She had moved back in with her parents, but didn't want to stay there. She needed a place, a job, and wanted Johnny to have his father in his life. Despite past betrayals, we considered letting her stay. Jen had no issue with it, and Manny asked if I could handle having her around. I wasn't sure, but she was smart and had a background in business and accounting. Since I was planning to renovate the old ski camp into a nature and fitness retreat, we agreed she could take on the financial and logistical side of things. Meanwhile, I took another fight, this time against New York's top contender, Rodrigo Sanchez. He was a powerhouse, and preparing for him was intense. The match went all 12 rounds. I knocked him down in the 9th, but he came back hard, knocking me down before the round ended. That moment lit a fire in me, and I fought aggressively, matching him blow for blow. The crowd roared, but I only saw him. The fight ended with me hammering him into the corner, the referee pulling me back when the bell rang. The judges called it a draw. In hindsight, it was fair. Had it gone 15 rounds, I might have won, or collapsed trying. Exhausted, I slept for 18 hours after the fight while Sanchez recovered from a broken rib. We skipped the initial press conference, but later, while rewatching the fight, I realized that avoiding that 9th round knockdown would have secured my victory. Before the press conference, Jen and I talked about my future in the ring. She believed Sanchez was the toughest opponent I'd ever face and saw a rematch as a huge opportunity. But I knew the rush of the fight could become an obsession, one that would take a toll. She insisted that if I fought again, it had to be the last. At the press conference, I praised Sanchez and answered questions. The fight was already being called a classic. Reporters asked about the final rounds, but there was no way to fully describe them. They weren't just a battle, they were something deeper. Back at the farm, life returned to normal. Kim took charge of the new venture, Mountain Adventures, hiring Harv Bristol, a skilled construction manager with experience in restoration and landscaping. He had recently gone through a rough divorce, which concerned me, but Kim assured me it wouldn't be a problem. She was drawn to him, and from the way she talked, it was clear she was already planning to pursue something with him. I told her not to let it interfere with business. She promised it wouldn't. I hoped she meant it. Kim didn't waste any time. Harv never stood a chance. Completely taken by her, he moved into the back room of the cabin she was using as an office. Their relationship wasn't just personal, they worked seamlessly together on the project, and it showed. Harv, once burdened by his past, seemed lighter, and Kim was thriving too. It wasn't hard to assume their chemistry extended beyond work. Harv's teenage sons, 15 and 16, joined the project during the summer, working alongside their father on construction. Despite their age, they were experienced and efficient, having spent years learning from him. They mostly lived in the city with their mother, though their visits were frequent. Occasionally, they teased Harv about Kim, until he put a stop to it. Everything was running smoothly, but life has a way of shaking things up. Jen and I decided to start a family, and soon after, she was pregnant. Not long after, Kim announced her own pregnancy. She and Harv seemed happy, though I had no doubt Kim had orchestrated the timing. Meanwhile, Kim's parents, Eileen and John, visited the farm to see Johnny. We all gathered for a large dinner at the Mountain Adventures cafeteria. By then, little Johnny was fully settled into our lives, and his grandparents planned a 2-week stay in one of the farm's main building rooms. On their second night, I woke up around midnight, and as I passed Manny's room, unmistakable sounds of intimacy echoed through the hall. The next morning, I mentioned it to Jen, but she had no solid answers. There was only one woman staying in the building besides her. The realization hit me. Kim confirmed it without hesitation. Her mother and Manny had instantly connected at dinner, and she wasn't surprised things escalated. She assured me her father didn't mind, even hinting that he sometimes preferred to observe rather than participate. That was a revelation I hadn't needed. Throughout their stay, it became clear that Eileen never spent a single night in her assigned room. Manny, once reserved, was visibly more at ease in her presence. When they returned for another visit, all pretense of secrecy disappeared. Their visits became a regular occurrence, and John seemed just as comfortable with the arrangement. Despite these distractions, the project progressed well, as did the pregnancies. Around the same time, Sanchez claimed the championship title in an impressive victory. Jen, never one to let an "I told you so" go to waste, reminded me that she had predicted it. I took a warm-up fight in Pittsburgh to stay sharp, knocking out my opponent in the 5th round. We soon held a meeting at Mountain Adventures to discuss the possibility of me challenging Sanchez for the title. Jen, Manny, Jenks, Kim, Harv, and I sat around the table. With project funding secured, money wasn't a major factor. Manny remained neutral while Jenks was adamant. He saw this as my shot at the title, something he had never reached himself. Jen looked at me with quiet certainty. She knew I had already made up my mind. This had to be my final fight, win or lose. I agreed. The bout was scheduled for March in Las Vegas, promising a significant payday. In the meantime, both the project and our families grew. Jen gave birth to our daughter, Melissa, while Kim and Harv welcomed a son, Jack. They married in a small ceremony at Mountain Adventures just before Jack's arrival. For 5 weeks, I prepared intensely for my last fight. Jenks and Manny dissected Sanchez's old matches in our previous fight, trying to predict his strategy. They expected him to aim for an early finish, knowing I had the advantage in the later rounds. Their analysis was spot on. The fight started as a technical exchange. I controlled the pace with jabs, while Sanchez landed a few clean rights. He had changed his approach, throwing straight punches without his usual setup, making them harder to anticipate. After the 7th round, Manny pointed out a flaw. Sanchez was dropping his left hand when throwing his right. I could counter it. In the 8th, I tested the theory. He launched a right, and I caught him with a perfect hook, sending him to the mat. He bounced up quickly, fury in his eyes, and charged. I met him at the ropes, hitting him with body shots while he managed a solid uppercut to my chin. By the 9th, he was relentless, striking from all angles. I absorbed several blows, including a punishing shot to the head that nearly floored me. Fatigue crept in, and when I returned to my corner, Jenks reminded me that I had won our last fight by wearing him down against the ropes. The question was, could I do it again? The next 5 rounds turned into a war. We exchanged brutal blows with little respite. I focused on his ribs and kidneys, knowing he was feeling the impact, even if he wasn't showing it. Twice his hooks rocked me, forcing me to clinch. By the final round, I felt drained, barely able to move. Jen, standing in my corner, silently raised a fist, my right fist. I understood. Stay away from the ropes, go for the knockout. I met Sanchez in the center of the ring, our gloves tapping briefly before we went all in. 2 minutes in, I backed him into the ropes, pounding his body. He began to falter. Sensing the moment, I stepped back and landed the hardest right I had ever thrown, sending him crashing to the canvas. Dazed, I stumbled toward my corner, convinced the fight was over. But Sanchez wasn't done. He climbed to his feet, barely responding to the referee's count, yet somehow convincing him to let it continue. For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other, knowing this was it. I jabbed at his face, and he swatted it away before throwing one last desperate right. The bell rang mid-motion, the punch missing its target. We collapsed against each other in exhaustion. He acknowledged my win, and I told him he was one hell of a fighter. His response was immediate. He would never fight me again. The victory was unanimous. I was the new champion. There was no post-fight press conference. Both Sanchez and I went straight to the hospital. I was released the next day, looking like I'd been run over. Back at the hotel, Jen and I barely left our room, absorbing the moment. Later, I faced the press to announce my retirement. I told them I had achieved what I wanted and had no desire to fight Sanchez again. I expected him to reclaim the title eventually. The fight had pushed me to my limit, and I knew I had nothing left to prove. We flew home the next day. 5 years passed. Jen and I had another child, Terrence. Melissa and Johnny were growing up strong, attending the local public school. Johnny had been training with Manny and had earned a reputation. Nobody messed with him. Kim and Harv welcomed another child, Joan, and their marriage remained solid, despite Kim's history of straying. Eileen and John settled permanently near Mountain Adventures. Their unconventional arrangement with Manny continued, though I never asked questions. The farm and Mountain Adventures thrived. Old faces remained. Rob and Billy still taught alongside Manny, Jen, and me. Neither had ever settled down, which, given everything, seemed almost surprising. Sanchez reclaimed the vacant title after my departure. As for Jamal, he never recovered from that knockout and eventually retired, now working in Washington public schools. He was married with kids, living a respectable life. I didn't hold resentment anymore. If not for him, I never would have reached the championship. Hate wears a man down. I had no use for it, and I had no use for boxing anymore either. These days, I found peace in the simple things: chopping wood, running the farm, and occasionally watching MMA fights for amusement. Boxing was behind me for good,